Yeah, of course. I think that is one of the main questions posed by the war and this geopolitical turning point, which is what this represents. It's really put the question of EU integration back on the political agenda. And that's because, of course, Ukraine and Moldova and Georgia have made their application for EU candidate member status. But of course, that also brings the question of the Western Balkans more into the center of the discussion as well. Now, what we've seen is that the process has been blocked for a very long time, and that's partly because of local difficulties, bilateral disputes in the region, affecting several countries in the region. But primarily, I would say actually that the process has been blocked, or is in this kind of stasis for a long time because of inertia from the EU side, and obviously quite a lot of skepticism about further enlargement to the region. But I do think that the war does then pose this strategic question for the EU, and it's been posed for a very long time because a commitment was made to this region in 2003 at Thessaloniki that this region would have the perspective of joining the EU. So they've been waiting a very long time. So the question has been there on the agenda for a long time. What this war has done is really crystallized this as a strategic choice for the EU, and it becomes a strategic choice now because this war is leading to a new division of Europe. That is what the war really means if Russia is successful in essentially annexing an even larger part of Ukraine and establishing this kind of frontier. So for the EU, the question is the EU prepared to see this region, the Western Balkans region, left in some kind of no man's land between the EU and Russia?
That's how the majority of the people feel, practically left behind or left in an empty space with possibilities of strong Russian influence. A lot of people have already developed negative emotions towards EU, and some of them say that they are supporting the policy of Russia, current policy of Russia, or they are even thinking of some kind of other unions with Euro-Asia unions. This makes the region even more fragile. Are there concerns in Europe about the fragility of the region and of the not only North Macedonia but Bosnia as well? Negotiations between Belgrade and Pristina are practically blocked. Is Russian influence dangerous for this region?
I think there certainly is concern in Europe, in Brussels, and in many European capitals about what happens to this region, about, as you say, the fragilities, and some countries are particularly fragile. This region is still quite poor in many respects, some poorer than others. Even though there's been a recovery and fairly respectable growth in recent years, pandemic aside, convergence is very, very slow. Catch-up growth is not what it should be, and that really exacerbates political problems, divisions, social inequalities. So there's lots of reasons, and that's apart from the outstanding bilateral disputes over status and borders and so on. So there's really a lot of vulnerabilities there in the region. So I think there is concern, And there obviously is support for integration in certain capitals, including, as it happens, from the UK, which has left the EU, but thinks that this is important for this particular region, that these are small countries, that they need to be brought in to the European Union. So there is support. On the other hand, there is clearly unease and there is clearly political opposition in key member states, and in France in particular, in the Netherlands, in some of the Nordic countries, in Denmark, for example. And this unease or opposition stems from several reasons. One, there is a concern, which is, I guess, the one that is expressed by President Macron most of the time, which is that bringing more countries into the EU is going to just reinforce existing difficulties of, reforming the union. It's going to dilute the coherence and leadership of the key, the leading member states. Obviously, there's concern about what it would mean politically in terms of maybe more immigration from the region. More competition over jobs and so on. So there's all sorts of concerns, but I think that those skeptics need to be probably more honest and more transparent about their position and whether they do or they do not support the region, because in the end the question that they have to ask themselves, EU leaders, EU countries, and especially the skeptics, is whether the risks of leaving out the Western Balkans outweigh the risks or the difficulties of bringing them in. And I would say
they had enough time until now.
Of course, but now I think what's happening is that the war is really crystallizing this choice, and it's a choice that has to be made. You can no longer dither or obfuscate, or delay in this situation where we are. We've got a war on the doorstep of Europe. We've got a potential new division of Europe. So I think it really means that choice now has to be made. You can't delay any longer. Europe needs to say where it stands on this, and to make that choice, and be brave. Actually, politicians need to be brave about making the geopolitical case, the political argument for bringing in the Western Balkans. This is a small region.
Only 18 million people altogether.
It's not going to cost very much. Actually, the EU can very well afford to bring in this region. It's not, we're not talking about very large countries. This is not Turkey. I understand there may be concerns about Ukraine, which is a much larger country with a much greater weight, but this region is small. The EU can afford to do it. The question is whether politicians are prepared to confront the political difficulties and have those arguments out and make the case for bringing in these countries.
Then in such circumstances, with a war on our doorstep, how can you explain the behavior of Bulgarian authorities? Blocking the way of North Macedonia and with Albania as well, because they go together. Claiming the parts of history, claiming that the Macedonian language is not Macedonian language, still talking about so-called language. This is 21st century. Bulgaria was 15 years in the EU. It should have been more European so far. Do you have any kind of explanation?
Well, it's very difficult to give an explanation, but this is something obviously that we've seen in the past. We've seen another veto that delayed the whole process, accession process for North Macedonia for a very long time, and that was resolved with quite a lot of bravery from...
And sacrifices?
Yes, and sacrifices too. Very big sacrifices on the side of North Macedonia, which sacrificed its name, which is no small thing.
Still, some people cannot understand here.
Of course, and I understand that too, because you know, that's your history, and ultimately, you know, the reason why I think these questions assume maybe larger dimensions here than other places is that well, history is important, a sense of belonging is important, language is important, identity is important, your sense of belonging to a nation state is important. That is the foundation of your identity, of democracy, you know, these things.
And human rights.
And actually this is, after all, this is what Ukraine is fighting for now, you know, its national sovereignty. An idea that has been much denigrated in recent years in many parts of Europe. But we now see how important it is, because it is the foundation of democracy, autonomy, self-determination, and so on. Now, I think questions of identity and history and language and so on assume a greater importance in this region because, partly because it has been left out of the EU and this kind of larger project, which many people saw as a kind of solution to some of these problems in the region. And also because this is a fairly poor region. And if people don't really believe that they have a realistic prospect of joining the EU, of transforming their lives and building a better future for themselves, for their children, then it's inevitable, I think, that people cling on more to what really does mean something to them, which is their identity and their language and so on. And obviously I think the other problem is that in many countries in this region we have fairly fragile coalitions, fragile governments operating without a very large majority. And in that situation, when many parties are contending for power, there is a tendency to politicize these kind of questions and these issues, and then it becomes a political football, and the consequences are obviously then very difficult, and it becomes very difficult to resolve.
Did you have an opportunity to have more details about the Austrian suggestions for step-by-step integration of Western Balkan countries, or French suggestion for, I don't know what exactly it contains, but not for fully integration and membership of the Western Balkan countries in EU, but step-by-step?
So yes, this idea that was put forward particularly by the French President Emmanuel Macron for a European political community that could, so something obviously short of membership. I suppose it's this idea again of concentric circles.
Is it kind of extension of the EU or a parallel organization? How do you understand it?
Well, we have to see the concrete details, but it obviously raises some alarm because it's then seen as an alternative to EU membership. Now, Macron has been at pains to say that this is not an alternative to membership, but his perspective and the perspective of others, such as the Netherlands, is that accession will take a long time. And we've already seen and heard that it's unlikely to happen before 2030. And Macron referred to many decades in relation to Ukraine. Maybe he didn't mean many decades for the Western Balkans, but he talked about many decades. Now the point is, as I see it, that is not a realistic time frame for membership. And what it means is that EU membership cannot then provide an anchor for anything in this region, any kind of political anchor for reform and so on. And then people give up. on the idea, and that's already what's happening, as you say. Most people, many people, maybe a majority of people now in the region and in this country do not believe that they will join the EU. So if we're talking about decades, then it becomes, that's not a realistic project. So the EU either needs to accelerate this process and take the steps to accelerate it, or be honest and say that actually this is not a perspective for the next decade, but what we can offer is something else. But really there need to be tangible benefits to something like that. For example,
to develop quickly the region, or to prepare quickly the region
for funding. What does it mean in terms of funding? And the amount of funding that is going to this region at the moment is very small compared with the funds that go to the Eastern EU member states or to the Southern Europeans, and they are not going to be transformative in terms of transforming infrastructure, in terms of raising the level of human capital, in terms of green transition, all these other targets. So funding, I think the EU needs to get serious about financing this region. There's been some suggestions that this region should be brought into the EU budget process, for example, and again, it wouldn't cost. It wouldn't cost that much actually for any existing member state. The cost of doing that would be very small, but the benefits could be very big.
Yes, of course, people are more interested to countries to be developed than to have the right to vote in Brussels. I'm sure that this plan could work if there is no way to become normally member of the EU. When EU is dragging its legs in this region, usually Americans come to finish the job quickly. Is it possible? Is it possible now to happen in terms of the war in Ukraine, of the security needed in this region, of closing the gaps for the Russian influence here?
Well, I think you're right to say that the Americans have played a very important role historically in this region. Certainly in the wars that followed the breakup of Yugoslavia, that was the case. Certainly in security terms, the US and NATO, they are the arbiters of what happens in this region, not the EU, which doesn't have a security and defense capacity. It does that through NATO. Now, the US has made its position very clear. It wants to see accession. It wants to see the Western Balkans join the EU. I think NATO will remain the only game in town in terms of security, and obviously countries in the Western Balkans have joined, including North Macedonia, including Albania, and that's important, obviously from a security perspective. What the war, I think, will do is will have an effect in terms of reviving NATO under US leadership. And the question is whether the Europeans will go along with that or strive to develop their own capacity in terms of a European defense capability. The war has already changed quite a lot. We've seen this security about turn in Germany, which is now going to commit 50 billion euros to building up its own armed forces, which is going to spend more than 2% of GDP on NATO and reaching its NATO commitment, and has committed to arm Ukraine. Something that it's never done before. So we already see that the war is bringing about a change. I just think it's going to be a very, very long time before the EU can have any kind of credible defence capacity. So it's NATO and the US remain the only game in town.
How different is the world now after 24th of February?
I think the world has been completely transformed. This is not just another regional war. This is has become something much bigger than that. This is a confrontation between Russia and the West. Obviously, the US and NATO are not directly involved in this conflict, but they're standing foursquare behind Ukraine. But as I say, many things have already changed, and there will be the war will catalyze more changes. First of all, it represents the breakdown of the post-Cold War order. It's this assertion of power by Russia is a repudiation of that order. What it's doing in Ukraine is creating a new division of Europe, which is inherently then going to be very unstable and dangerous. And if Sweden and Finland join, we're going to see this new kind of frontier, if you like, which will be militarized. And so the world becomes a much more unstable and dangerous place. I think it's going to accelerate the bifurcation of the global order between East and West. We have seen that China is not prepared to forsake Russia, and I don't expect that it will do at all. So this invasion by Russia will accelerate this process of decoupling between the West on the one hand and China and Russia on the other hand. And we have also seen that about 2/3 of the world, of countries in the world, are not taking sides in this war, or they are remaining neutral or actually leaning towards Russia. And that's very, very many countries in Africa, it's some in the Middle East, in Latin America and so on. So that's a very big challenge, I think, for the democratic world, to a very big challenge for democracy, to bring those countries, some of those countries, on side in this battle over something very fundamental values, which are worth fighting for.
So democracy is not winning in the world?
Not at the moment, no.
For what Europeans should be prepared as a consequence of the war? I mean, in economic terms.
Well, in economic terms, obviously the war is having a very big impact already, and the main channels of impact are via the sanctions on Russia, direct sanctions plus indirectly is having a big impact. Obviously supply chains, which were already disrupted because of the pandemic, are now the problems being compounded by closure of airspace and land routes and destruction of infrastructure and so on. But the biggest impact obviously is coming through the commodities channel and rising commodities prices, not just oil and gas, but also agricultural food commodities, metals and so on. And that is driving this very rapid increase in inflation, which we expect to reach 8.5% globally this year, very high in the US, very high in Europe. And that's going to then have a negative impact on growth because it's going to hit household consumption, especially in a region like this where households spend much more on food and energy. And it will also hit business and business investment as well. So even though we've seen very strong growth in the first quarter of this year in this region, in every country in this region, because that's the post-pandemic recovery that was taking place, it's going to slow as the year goes on. And even though we'll have positive growth, quarter by quarter, growth will slow. And as we go into 2023 and this war continues, which we expect it to continue for actually a long time, and prices remain elevated, then the impact on growth will be quite negative and severe, especially next year. And just to conclude on this point about the economic fallout, the other consequence of this runaway inflation is that central banks, the Fed, the ECB, plus central banks in this region are being forced to raise interest rates to try and counteract the increase in inflation, and then that has, again, a knock-on effect on the economy and raises difficult questions. It will obviously dampen growth. It raises questions for highly indebted countries about servicing their debt, and so also for individuals and households too. So this is a problem. In terms of the war and how long it might last, we expect the war to be, at The Economist and the Economist Intelligence Unit, we expect the war to be protracted, and there's several reasons for that. One is because of the issues at stake. They are quite existential. As I said, for Ukraine is fighting for national sovereignty, for its land and self-determination and so on. So it's very difficult to make concessions and compromises on those. On the other side, the war is not existential for Russia, but it's existential for the Kremlin and Vladimir Putin, who need to be seen to win something from this war. So that makes the prospect of negotiations, some kind of compromise, very difficult. And the other thing is that Ukraine has demonstrated the will to fight, the morale to fight, and it's also being aided in that respect with financial and other support, obviously in terms of weapon supply from the West. That means that Ukraine will have the capacity to keep fighting. Now, at some point, both sides will become exhausted, and there may be a pause in the war. There might not be a negotiated solution. There could be a pause, and then things can start up again. Even if there were to be a negotiated solution at some point, I think it's for Ukraine to determine when that happens and the terms on which it's prepared to negotiate. Nobody else has the right to determine that. But even if that were to happen, it's very difficult to see some neat and tidy solution because of the nature of what's at stake, the nature of the issues at stake. And so the danger is that what we will see is a very long conflict, which is not really susceptible to a resolution, and this could just turn into a frontier war, a war without end, more than a frozen conflict. So as long as the war is raging, in terms of there being a hot war, energy prices and commodities prices in general are going to remain elevated.
Is this a war for territory, or this is a kind of lesson, Putin's lesson towards West?
Well, obviously, Vladimir Putin and Russia have not really set out with any clarity what their objective is. We can surmise what their objectives are, and we can also surmise what their rationale for the war is. I mean, the first point, no matter what grievances Russia might have, this war is indefensible. It's an abomination. There's no justification for it. It seemed to be that Russia's objective for many, many years, and certainly in the period running up to the start of the war, was to achieve some kind of new security arrangement in Europe, and they wanted to negotiate that with America, with the US, and nobody else, and those were the negotiations that have taken place. They seem to have concluded that there's no prospect of that happening, and have resorted to this invasion. And it would seem that at least the minimal objective is to prevent Ukraine's further integration into NATO or the EU, to create some kind of buffer between Russia and the West, which will include part of eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine, plus Belarus and Kazakhstan. It also seems to be a demonstration by Russia that it wants to be taken seriously as a major power. And beyond that, who knows what the motivations are. But I think the one thing we can say with certainty is that this war is not going to end up the way that Vladimir Putin or anybody else in the Kremlin imagined it would. And that is the nature of war, that all wars contain or produce fatal surprises, especially for those who prosecute them and launch them. And usually in the long term, they have negative consequences.
So Europe should brace itself up.
So it also is a big question for Europe about what it stands for, what it's prepared to fight for, to what degree it's prepared to support Ukraine, and what steps it will now take to make sure that this division of Europe is not cemented and doesn't become something of the dimensions of the Cold War.
Thank you very much, Ms. Will.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.